It's published on Facebook. Like you said, like, yeah. I don't know how. Sideways.
This image, like, right? Exactly. This is what New Yorkers think of our politics.
Good evening, folks. Welcome to the second, but really the first ProCon at the Pier series for 2017. We were scheduled for last week. The event got canceled due to police activity. We are back this year once again for a 3-part series. We'll be back here next Monday and the following Monday. So I wanted to first welcome you all who are here physically today. I also want to welcome the people who are watching either on Facebook Live or on our video feed. There is a large audience that's participating in this discussion tonight. Tonight's discussion is about America's shrinking middle class. Why is it happening, and whether or not more or less government regulation is the cure. This is all part of a series related to civil discourse. That's our hashtag for the night. If you tweet about it, Facebook, whatever, use the hashtag civil discourse. What we're trying to do is show the rest of the world that we can disagree without being disagreeable. That is the point. So for tonight's debate, we're going to have 2 debaters that are going to demonstrate exactly that. Now, to facilitate in our debate, we have a few things that I think you'll like. One is we are measuring our impact. We have a voting board in the back. If you haven't voted, please do, where you can select whether you are pro or con this question. Do we need more government involvement to save the middle class from disappearing? After the event, do the same thing. Vote on our after the debate panel, and we'll see if you change your mind. And then we'll record those opinions and reflect them on our website so you can track it there as well. Now, this event tonight is being brought to us by Procon.org, the organization I'm here representing. We represent the pros and the cons of controversial issues. It's a free, nonpartisan organization. We've been around for going on 13 years now. We're joined by the Santa Monica Pier in presenting tonight's discussion. And all of this is brought to us courtesy of the Arthur N. Roop Foundation. And so we're grateful to our sponsors and our partners, and of course to all of you here and all of you at home. What I'd like to do next is introduce our moderator for tonight's event. This brings me great joy, folks. So tonight we have Alex Cohen. She's the voice of KPCC 89.3. She's the morning host of Morning Edition. She was the host of Take Two, All Things Considered, Marketplace, Weekend America, Day to Day, etc., etc. She's a graduate of Brown and UC Berkeley. She's won a lot of journalism awards, and she's earned enough fame as a reporter to play herself in movies. In the last few months, she's interviewed Gustavo Dudamel, she's interviewed Mayor Garcetti, and I heard her just the other day interviewing Dolores Huerta, the famous labor rights organizer. Now, some of you may know Alex for a different reason. I know it. You may know her as Axles of Evil. She is a well-known roller derby champion. If you don't know her from Axles, you might know her as Smother Teresa from her roller derby days. But to me, that's a big plus. I know she's going to be able to moderate this debate, keep these folks in check. So with all my faith in her capabilities in roller derby, and of course her chops as a very highly awarded journalist and someone who's genuinely focused on civil discourse in our country. She's a real Los Angeles treasure. We're thrilled to have her as our moderator today. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Miss Alex Cohen.
Thank you. My mom's out of a job. Tommy's now hired. I don't need anyone else. I should note, just to be factually accurate, though, retired roller derby player at present. But I do always love a good, clean fight. So we're going to hop to that pretty quickly. I want to introduce our 2 panelists that we have for this evening, and I'm going to do so by the color of their lovely cardigan, so kindly provided.
I'm wearing mine though. He's not wearing his.
Not yet. See, the fighting has already begun. All right, so we have here to my left, soon to be wearing the blue cardigan, Joseph Sanberg, our proponent for the evening. He is co-founder and chair of Aspiration.com, founder of Calle EITC for me, a founding investor in Blue Apron, and a board member for companies such as Bright Funds and Ivy.com. A warm welcome to Joe. And on our con side, sporting the lovely maroon jumper, as the folks across the pond would say, we have Brian Calle, Vice President of Opinion for the Southern California News Group, English instructor at Chapman University, Editor-in-Chief of CalWatchdog.com, and also published in Forbes, Bloomberg News, Fox News, and many other media outlets. So welcome to Brian as well. And we're going to jump right into it just to start things off and to give everyone here a better understanding of where these two gentlemen are coming from on the topic at hand, which is, do we need more government involvement to save the middle class from disappearing? Each of these folks will have 3 minutes for their opening statements, and Joe will begin with you. And I'm watching my watch not because I am bored, but because I am a very strict timekeeper.
Well, thanks everyone for being here tonight. First, we need to ask, why is the middle class under pressure? And even more specifically, why is it that in 2017, 3 of 4 Californians couldn't handle a $700 surprise expense? But pause on that for a second. Think about the times in your life when you couldn't pay a bill. Remember how that pit in your stomach just overwhelmed you? It was paralyzing. That's what 3 of 4 Californians experience every single day. And the reason that 3 of 4 Californians couldn't handle a surprise expense is because our economy has become dominated by monopolies that have left workers with low wages and little choice, consumers with bad choice, and small businesses struggling to break through and hire. The typical conservative progressive divide over the last 30 years has basically been this, and credit to my friend Matthew Stoller, who articulated this framework. We have robbers that are looting our economy, and conservatives say the robbers get to keep most of the loot, and progressives say the robbers have to give a lot of the loot back. But the reason we need programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit to begin is because monopolies are robbing us of our economic freedom, our ability to earn living wages, and our ability to have good choices as consumers. And so the whole matter of what the government ought to do to address the decline of the middle class is not simply about, should we raise taxes here, increase this program here, but rather how we get at the anti-competitive behavior of monopolies that are dominating too many of our industries. And in my view, the only way we can get at the power that monopolies have accumulated in our economy and over our lives is with more effective government regulation that breaks up the anti-competitive power of these monopolies, redistributes power to workers and consumers, and makes it possible again for small and medium-sized businesses to emerge, compete, and hire.
And he did it with time to spare. You give that minute back to the middle class, I take it. Okay, all right. So we will turn now to you. The clock starts afresh at 3 minutes. Brian Calle, have at it with your opening statement.
Awesome. Well, I will try to be brief because a mentor of mine told me you cannot be both bad and brief. Really happy to be here. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. For a variety of reasons. When people look at me and they hear where I went to school or my jobs, they think, oh, wealthy, he went to USC, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, wealthy white guy, what do I care what he has to say? Actually, my last name is Calle, which is street in Spanish. I'm part Latino. While I look lily white, I can assure you that I am Latin from the waist down. That is not a dirty joke. I can just dance really well. I grew up very poor. My mother was on welfare and food stamps. She was a single mother who raised me and my sister, the strongest woman that I ever met. And so economic issues and the middle class are important to me because my mother struggled not to maintain a middle class status, but to get to the middle class where she is today, because we were far below middle class status. And my mother learned very quickly that being on food stamps and being on welfare was not going to help her get to the middle class. It was not going to help her sustain her family. So my mother made various choices over the course of her life, but what she did was she decided that she was going to get off any kind of government assistance and she was going to work 3 jobs. She worked as a secretary, she worked in a loan office as an assistant, and then in the mornings at 3 a.m. she would get in our minivan and she would deliver newspapers with me or my younger sister. Ironically enough, today, one of the newspapers that I help run editorial for is one of those newspapers. So it's come full circle for me. But seeing the experience of my mother and living life with her, I viewed how the government assistance programs that she was told would help her redeem her life, that would help her get on a path to become middle class, actually were just meant to hold her down and to hold her in a position of poverty and sustain her there. And she said, enough is enough, and I don't want it anymore. And so for me, when I think of this topic and I think of the future of our country, it really scares me because income inequality is one of the most pressing issues of the day. The problem is, to your point, is that I don't think Republicans or Democrats, conservatives or progressives really understand how to fix this issue, because they want to talk about how we can do more of the same programs who haven't helped the most vulnerable among us today. And now that the programs in this country are being offered to more and more people, and now that the problem is even worse, we think more of the same is going to solve it. We need new, innovative solutions, and those solutions, I think, start at the community level, not at a government regulatory level. So that's all I got to say.
So from here on out, we do want to keep the discourse civil, but all bets are off beyond that. We're hoping to have an engaging conversation between these two. We will eventually be opening it up to you, our audience members. I would like to backtrack just for a moment before we talk about fixing the problem. Let's talk about how we define the problem and why it's a problem. So I'd like to hear from both of you. And Joe, again, let's begin with you. How would you define the middle class? And is it disappearing a bad thing? And if so, why?
Well, I think what matters more than these abstract definitions of middle class and whatnot is rather the kind of future we want to create and what life ought to be like for us and our neighbors. And I think our future ought to be this. If you work, you should live with full financial security and be able to afford your basic needs. And I think everyone pretty much agrees with that. But the uncomfortable reality is that most people who work can't afford their basic needs and have no sense of financial security. That the problem in our economy isn't that people aren't working and are living off the system or whatever you wanted to use to describe it. The problem is people are working, they're working 2 jobs and they still can't afford their basic needs. That the fundamental problem we have to fix is a failure of our social contract. I think we all basically believe in this social contract that if you work and you play by the rules, you should be able to live with security, dignity, and afford your basic needs. But 3 out of 4 people can't. So middle class, upper class, working class, whatever the adjective, the more specific question is how we create a future where everyone who is working can afford their basic needs. And I wish that it were as simple as letting the free market run its course. But there is an undeniable present where people are working really hard and can't afford their basic needs. And that's a failure of the free market. It's a failure of ineffective government regulation. So the answer isn't as simple as more regulation. It's a question of better and more effective regulation.
I'm going to cut you off there because we're not at solutions and changes yet. But just to kind of extract what you're saying, it sounds like you're saying no real fixed definition of middle class, but yes, it's disappearing, and that's a problem because that's a failure of our social contract, basically the fabric of this country. Does that sound about right?
Well, if I may, let me add this. One of the problems with politics is that there's all this jargon that doesn't mean anything to real life, right? People don't wake up in the morning and say, gosh darn it, I'm suffering from the decline of the middle class. People wake up in the morning and say, I'm working 2 jobs and I still can't afford what I need in life. And that's the problem we have to solve.
All right, Brian, your definition of middle class. Do you think there is a definition of middle class?
You know, when I think of the middle class, I think of my grandmother and grandfather. My grandmother was a house mom for most of her life, though she helped with little side things that my grandfather needed to do. And my grandfather was the steward at Vaughn's Bakery. And he was a steward, a manager there, and he was able to sustain the needs of the family. He was able to put food on the table. He was able to pay for a car. He was able to pay for the house. And when they retired, he had a pension, and they were comfortable in their later years. They were able to not go on lavish vacations. They loved going to Las Vegas for whatever reason and playing the slot machines, which drove me nuts. But that's the only thing that they were ever able to do that I remember growing up. And so when I think of the middle class, it's being able to pay all of your bills, being able to save for your future, and being able to have retirement security. I worry that today, in 2017, that fewer and fewer people are able to do that, particularly in California, because not only are wages lower, which we'll talk about more tonight, but housing affordability is such a big piece of this puzzle, where you have a situation where at one point in our history, 10% of your income would go to your housing, and now it's like 50% in parts of Southern California and other parts of the state and country. And so for me, being able to afford your house, being able to afford your food, being able to save for retirement, and not living paycheck to paycheck is middle class. And I worry that that's not the same middle class that we saw in my grandparents' generation. We don't see that today.
So neither of these gentlemen want to give numbers or percentages. So let's just go with gut feeling for a moment. To turn to the audience, how many of you would at this moment in time consider yourself middle class? Would you raise your hand? All right. So there's a fair number of us out there. So Brian, you just touched on wages, and I think that's a good place to jump into right now. Does the idea of a minimum wage imposed by government, be it federal, state, local, does that help or hurt the shrinking middle class?
You know, I think that the minimum wage is a good idea in theory, and I think that how it's implemented and managed is part of the problem. I think that on balance it probably helps, but the challenge is, as one of my various students got into a debate with, I have guest speakers at Chapman University every week, and one of the speakers was the head of a labor union, and one of my students said, well, if we raise the minimum wage to $25, doesn't that mean all the things that I buy are going to be more expensive, so net I'm not going to get any more money? And she went back and forth with them. And so I think that when you think of the minimum wage, it's not something that we can apply universally to every community, because a high minimum wage in Santa Monica is not the same as a high minimum wage in Victorville, is not the same as a high minimum wage in Nevada or Missouri. And so I think some universal policy on minimum wage isn't necessarily a good thing. I think personally that the minimum wage should be implemented as local as humanly possible. So if that's the state level, that's smart. Even better at the local level, because then you can assess the needs of your local community. And a government that is closest to the people is most accountable to the people. And I think you can target solutions when it's closer to your community. What I worry about is when we start to have these one-size-fits-all policies that we think are good for everyone, but we know we live in a diverse country. We know that not every community is the same, and the same approach to either education or economics is not necessarily going to work. And so for me, minimum wage, good idea, but implementation should be at the hyper-local level.
And sitting here as the moderator, I take neither side. My sweater, if I had one, would be purple. But Joe, I think one of the arguments that you also hear a lot, so what we're hearing here from Brian is, sure, minimum wage, but maybe not a universal one, look more locally. But even if you implement, we've seen this here in Los Angeles, a local raise in minimum wage, you have business owners who say, I can't afford this, and I'm going to hire fewer people. So that's not a solution. Your thoughts on minimum wage?
I think we ought to have a higher minimum wage. I think we ought to have a fight for 25. I don't think that the higher minimum wage hurts workers. To the opposite, especially at a moment when we have structural deflation, and most people don't have the money to afford the things they need to buy. The bigger problem is making work pay better. This is basically the scoop with our economy. People who have money don't need to buy anything anymore. And people who need to buy things are working hard and have no money. And, in policy, you have to take risk. And the risk I'd like to take is on the side of making work pay better. And, to those who say, well, some business owner is going to be worse off with a higher minimum wage, I'd say come up with a business idea that is good enough to provide a living wage for your workers, a fair deal for your customers, and good profits for your shareholders. I'd love to be in the NBA, but the NBA doesn't have 4 million players, and I'm probably like the 4 millionth best basketball player, right? Similarly, if you want to own a business in California, you need to come up with a business idea that is good enough to create pie for your workers, to have a living wage, pie for your customers to get a fair deal, and pie for your shareholders to do well. And, to business owners that complain, woe is me, that we have to pay our workers more. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take the side of the Californians who are working hard and cannot afford their basic needs. And I think we need to take risk to make it easier for those workers to pay for their basic goods: food, shelter, transportation, education, and healthcare.
I'd like to jump in there because, while I support a locally imposed minimum wage, $25 universally seems a bit much to me. And that's partially because I live in Southern California, and a large part of the job community in Southern California is the service industry. And this restaurant right here, Marisol and others on this pier, I guarantee their margins are so thin that if you impose a $25 minimum wage for all of the employees, what ends up happening is they go out of business, which means more and more people don't have jobs. Because there's nothing, if you raise the minimum wage that much on the service industry, which makes such small margins, they have to raise their prices to an extent that no one will come anymore. So, in theory, it sounds great, and I would love everyone to make $25 an hour as a minimum wage, but isn't it true that in some industries that's just not going to be probable? Because while, maybe in the tech communities or other jobs, you can just redefine a product and then, take your iPhone and make it a flat screen and then get rid of the button, and then you could charge $1,000 for it. But, you can't charge $1,000 for a margarita.
Yes, please.
I actually think it would be the opposite. If we paid all of these workers at these restaurants on the pier $25, you know what would happen? Those workers would be able to afford to eat at these restaurants. The reality is that all of the people on this pier who are working so hard can't even afford to buy the food that they're serving. And I dispute the economic notion that a higher minimum wage for all the workers on this pier would result in higher prices lower margins that would put these businesses out. These businesses might have to raise their prices a little bit. Maybe they'd have to raise their prices a little more than a little bit. And all of their current customers who are making upper middle income wages would do just fine paying a little bit more. And finally, the wait staff at these restaurants would be able to eat the food they're serving to these customers.
Before we get any hungrier, and because we could easily spend all night talking solely about minimum wage, I want to go back, Joe, and ask you about, in Brian's opening remarks, he mentioned some of the programs that his mother relied on, such as food stamps and welfare, and he called them, if I remember correctly, a trap more than something that's helpful. Your thoughts on programs such as these? What role do they play in expanding this disappearing middle class?
Well, programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, food stamps, the Child Care Tax Credit, these are all necessary, in my mind, to make work pay better and to create a safety net for the people who just frankly don't have a fair shake from birth. One of my conservative friends once asked me, with regard to the people we serve through Calle AITC for Me, which is a program that organizes in low-income communities to make sure that people know about the Earned Income Tax Credit, claim it, and get free tax prep. This conservative friend of mine asked, what did these people do wrong to end up in this place? And I had to collect myself, and I answered my friend in this way. They were probably born as a person of color in South Los Angeles. The truth is, so much about the circumstances of our birth define the opportunities that we have in our life. Now, if you disagree with that view, we can agree to disagree. But my understanding is a lot of the challenges that we face as adults are created by the luck of the circumstances of where we're born and the prejudices that we have to face throughout the course of our life. And a lot of these social policies are important to remedy those prejudices. Now, these social policies aren't enough. One of the reasons we need these social policies to begin is because we have a rigged economy that structurally advantages big businesses and monopolies. And so the deeper question that we have to tackle in the coming years is, how do we move away from a monopoly economy where a small number of companies control a lot of power over our economy, our lives, and our politics? But while we're working at breaking down that monopoly economy, these social policies that make work pay better and create a safety net and offset a lot of the structural prejudices that exist in our economy are necessary, and in my view, they ought to be expanded.
For me, again, having grown up on this and completely agree, I think your life circumstances determine oftentimes where you end up. And I think a big part of that is education, which I hopefully will get into later, because I think that when I think about welfare and I think about food stamps and I think about these programs aren't necessarily working the way that they were intended to. I think what they were intended to be is they were intended to be a way in which individuals, families were able to sustain themselves as a safety net. And I believe wholeheartedly we need a social safety net in this country, wholeheartedly. But I think we don't do a good enough job in terms of crafting public policy to help people get from where they need a safety net to the next level, whether that's education, whether that's retraining, whatever it might be. And the challenge that I see is much like the education trap, and I called these programs a trap, where it's like, okay, well, we're going to give you this so that you're comfortable for a time being. Well, just giving some people something to sustain themselves for a little while doesn't really solve the root problem. Similarly, education is a big issue. You're not going to solve the root problem of when you grow up and where you grow up, and how that determines your success in the future without solving the public education problem. One of the things I didn't mention in my opening remarks about my mother is that she had the intestinal fortitude to lie about where we lived. So she had a friend in a wealthy area about 20 or 30 minutes from where we lived. So she asked her friend if she could falsify a utility bill so I could go to a better school, and I would not be standing here if she did not do that. So for me, when I talk about how these things are a trap, we're not focusing our public policy on fixing the actual problem, which is helping people get to a level where we have a sustainable middle class.
I'm glad that you brought up education, because I do want to turn to that in a moment, but I just want to get a little bit of clarification, Ryan, because what I just heard there is you're saying I don't want to completely abolish the idea of a social safety net, but considering our main question tonight is to what extent the federal government can and should get involved, can you just give us a brief sense of what you envision that perfect safety net looking like?
Yeah, that's a tough and great question. I think that a safety net looks something like a limited amount of time where you get on it and you get off of it. I think it involves some re-education and some type of help in doing so. And I think that it also hopefully involves some kind of government programming where you have access to someone, call it a counselor, like you have a college counselor who helps you get into a college, who helps you start to make progress in finding a job or getting the skill sets that you need.
Joe, I just want to give you a quick moment to respond to that before we do move on to the topic of education. How does Brian's plan sound to you?
Well, it doesn't sound like it's enough. I think we ought to have a social safety net that ensures that everyone can afford their basic needs. Frankly, I don't care how much it costs. I think we have to organize our society, in accordance with our values. How do we want to treat each other? What kind of society do we want? Do we accept a society where so many people are living paycheck to paycheck, where access to healthcare determines how long you live, and your access to healthcare is determined so much by the circumstances of your birth, by your job security, by how much you make? And so I think it's just a question of your vision of a great society. And my vision of a great society is one where everyone can afford their basic needs. And it's a society that we're more than rich enough to build. It's a society that we haven't yet created because we've chosen not to create it. That we've embraced a lot of, frankly, disproven and wrong notions of the way that markets do and don't work. And I think, frankly, it's a society that Gen Xers and millennials are increasingly deciding that we are going to build.
Let's talk about education, because our clock is swiftly winding down. I think a lot of people could easily make the argument that one of the reasons why our middle class is disappearing is because so many members of that middle class are paying off college loans forever and are really struggling to do so. What do you see as the role of education in the plan to try to expand and reinvigorate the middle class? And what role should the government take in that, especially when it comes to college debt?
Well, I think everyone should be able to attend college for free. I also think that the problem with education starts well before college, and it begins with the failed funding mechanism that we have for public schools in this country, a funding mechanism that's based on the real estate wealth of your community, that hardens prejudice in our educational system towards great opportunities for those who grow up in wealthy areas, and really compromised opportunities for those who grow up in areas that aren't as wealthy. And so if we want to be honest about the problems with our educational system, it begins well before college. And if we want to be honest about the answer, it requires getting at the basic structure of how we fund our public schools, which is a wrong-headed system that hardens inequality.
Brian.
I couldn't agree with you more that the education system is probably the paramount part of this debate. For me, it's also the reason why I don't think that a one-size-fits-all from the federal government on solving the shrinking middle class is going to work. Because if that were the case, I would say that our public education system would be great. In California, we spend a lot of money on education, particularly K through 12, more than most states. Yet California is 48 out of 50 states in terms of educational outcomes. 48 out of 50 states. We have the most bureaucracy. We have the most government involvement in education in this state, yet our state is near the very bottom. So for me, when I look at the success points in education, I see success in charter schools up and down the state. And we're trying to put on more regulations to actually get rid of charter schools. So for me, it's an expansion of educational choice, which means an expansion of charter schools and innovative schools that can help educate from K through 12 so that young people are starting off on an even playing field and then choosing to go to college. I also think, as a college professor, having taught at Cal State LA, Cal State Fullerton, and now full-time at Chapman University, that I would be concerned by giving away college education free, because I think when you give something away for free, you devalue it. And college was something that for me is very personal, because no one else in my family ever went to college. So I had to work very hard. I had to work several jobs, and I had to pay for it. And I'm still paying off my student loans, and it really sucks. And I think that the conversation there isn't to make education free for everyone, because number one, how do you do that? And why would we devalue education that way? But instead, how do we make it more affordable? How do we get the costs in line? Because even as someone who works very closely at a university, I realize that there are so many things that our university does and others do that we should be talking about the cost structure for students going into the university system, which is why they get sucked in this trap of very large student debts, not giving it away from free. And frankly, almost every university in this country gets government debt or government assistance from the federal government. So that should come with some strings, and that's probably a price cap.
As the sun begins to set, know that this part of the conversation is about to come to an end, and we're going to turn it over to our audience for some questions. There's so many different directions we can go, but as the one woman here on the stage, I would like to ask how both of you see the federal government and its role with women. We do make up half of the population, be it equal pay for men and women, be it parental time off. How does that figure into all of this? And Joe, let's start with you and give you about a minute.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we ought to finally fully ratify the ERA. And we can. And then we ought to expand upon the ERA to ensure that it covers all the intersectionality of wage gaps. Latinas in California make about 44 cents on the dollar. African American women make about 54 cents on the dollar in California. And single moms, in particular single moms of color, are at the front edge of creating California's future. Most people who earn the earned income tax credit are single moms of color that face a lot of wage discriminations at small and medium-sized businesses, that face a lot of discrimination in the freelance economy, who are paid without benefits. So we have to get at that from every angle, federally, with things like the ERA, at a state level by introducing more vigorous laws that ensure wage parity. We have to make sure that single moms can work by having daycare and childcare and healthcare for their families. When we talk about educational outcomes and how much we spend on education, one of the reasons why we spend so much in California on education but don't get the outcomes that we ought to have is so many kids go to school hungry. 20% of kids in California grow up in poverty. It doesn't matter how much you spend on schools. If kids are going to school hungry, they are not going to learn. And so the question of education and of financial security need to be reintegrated. And we need to tackle economic justice and educational justice at the same time. And as part of that educational justice, we need to not privatize our greatest public good, which is our educational system. The answer isn't the shortcut of privatizing our public schools. The answer is creating financial security for low-income families so that kids go to our public schools fed, not hungry.
I want to bring it on back to women. Brian.
I'm going to answer the women question, but charter schools are not private schools, just for the record. They are public schools. They just get to operate differently. And
a great topic of debate for hopefully a future pro-con, especially in this city right now. But again, women, you can try to deny and ignore us, but we're not doing that.
I would never. I was raised by a very strong, independent woman. And actually, my mentor, my first job at a college was for Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, who passed away last year. So I have I've been shaped by very strong women. So for me, I think it's unconscionable that we in 2017 still have a situation where there is a gender pay gap. I think it's horrible. I think that we've also been talking about this, and we've been talking about shattering the glass ceiling for a very long time in this country at the federal government, and every policy that we try to enact doesn't do it. What I'm most excited about and what I'm most hopeful about is that we're seeing a cultural shift in this country that's demanding it of employers and demanding it of the private sector. For me, most of the biggest transformational issues that have happened in my lifetime, whether it be the iPhone that's in my pocket or the technology rise, did not come from a policy in Washington, D.C. It came because people on the ground came together to do something better. And because of the advent of social media, because we're all so interconnected and we can gather so easily at things like this, you're seeing movement, and we're holding businesses accountable and saying, if there is a pay equity gap here in your company, we're going to know about it and we're not going to use your products. And what happens? They react and they change faster than any policy in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. is going to get done. So for me, it absolutely needs to be done, and the best way that we can do it is through social pressure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, the time has come now. You, sir, right there in the front row, your question.
Yeah, it seems to me there's a category disconnect here. We're talking about welfare at a very low level here. We're talking actually about welfare to big corporations. Wasn't that welfare?
We have a category disconnect here. We're talking about welfare at a very low level and not all that expensive compared to the welfare that's handed out to Wall Street when they screwed up the global economy, to the defense system that's unauditable, trillions going into it, to black money going into the CIA. You can just find these welfare programs all over the place. And that's where this government regulation issue comes in.
I'm going to remind you, because our time is brief, questions. One question that can be put
How
to
do you
vote.
straighten out these category differences?
Do you want to go? Sure. Well, we should end welfare for monopolies. And the reason that we need all of these programs to begin is because monopolies control our industries and are leaving workers with very little bargaining power, leaving consumers with miserable choices, and controlling more and more of our lives. You know, when you see United Airlines dragging passengers off of their airplanes, you see monopolies. When you see Wells Fargo opening millions of accounts illegally without their customers' authorization, you see monopolies. When you see small and medium-sized businesses that are struggling to break through and hire, you see monopolies. Let me give you a really serious statistic. In half of all of America's industries, 4 or fewer companies control 25% of that industry. This is the golden era of monopolies in a way unseen since the early 1900s, which requires a response on the level of what Teddy Roosevelt brought when he led the last great antitrust movement. So until we actually get at the anti-competitive behaviors of big monopolies that are leaving workers with low wages and no bargaining power, consumers with bad choices, and all of us with less and less control over our own lives, we will be stuck in this debate over more EITC, less EITC. But we have to change the whole script and get at the excessive power that these companies have over our economy, over our lives, and ultimately over our democracy. You know, Justice, I want to add this one point if I may. Justice Brandeis said, right, you cannot have both wealth concentrated in the hands of a few and democracy. Democracy and monopolies cannot coexist, which is why taking on the monopolization of our economy isn't just a matter of revitalizing the middle class, it is a matter of preserving our basic democratic institutions.
So, Brian, over to you because our time is limited, and I want to squeeze in at least one more audience question. We have talked a fair bit about the notion of welfare in the notion of things like food stamps and those sorts of programs, but the welfare that I think our audience member here is asking about, what is seen by many as welfare granted to corporations who occasionally take advantage of that. What role does the federal government need to play there?
So I would argue that's not the government getting more involved, that's the government getting out, because we are currently offering too many corporate welfare programs to corporations. I think that we need to simplify and change the tax code and make it so that this thing is much more streamlined. When Donald Trump, who I did not vote for, gets on stage and says, you know, I've used every loophole in the tax code and it's benefited me and blah, 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 huge. For me, that's like the one thing he said that was true, right? So it's true. We need to simplify the tax code and we need to get rid of corporate welfare. And I think that'll do a lot in terms of solving this problem. But that's not getting more government involved. That's getting government out of it, because what's happened in Washington, D.C. is that you have one party that wants to hand out to certain groups and you have another party that wants to hand out to other groups. And both parties want to turn a blind eye and allow this other big group over here to have all the minis that it can possibly get. And it's really funny, right? Because Hillary Clinton got admonished because she took money from Wall Street. And that was one of the things that got hit. Campaign trail after campaign trail. Just this week, President Obama just did a $400,000 speech for a Wall Street private equity firm. He's doing another one in a couple of days. So there is one group in this country that gets special privileges, and that's the corporate welfare that you're talking about. And what government has done is we've enabled them to do that, and we need to unenable them.
You sit with the microphone.
Okay. As a person who brought a business from 18 cents in my savings account and 17 cents in my checking account with no silver spoon in my mouth passed from my parents who did it on his own, I can tell you business owners who I service over 2,300 personal sales. Of those customers, I've had a vast majority tell me that anywhere near $15 an hour, they would go out of business. And I've got 6 customers this year in North Carolina who are California companies that have moved there, who said they did it because of your tax issues here and your economy issues. How can you sit here on the stage and say, yes, we need not $15 an hour, we need $25 an hour, when I know personal customers that are saying we can't operate in that economy and still have enough money to pay the number of people we have and still be able to provide the same kind of service to our clientele. You can't do both. How do you assume that these people should, your idea is not good enough, let's put 40% of the market out of work because they're not smart enough to have the great idea. Let maybe the monopolies are to take it, your landscapers, your car wash folks, your kid who, you know what, I'm not smart enough to get an
I think
education.
you should come take my seat because you're far more conservative.
I am a right-wing Republican for sure.
This is really an important question because it merits reconnecting the outcomes and fates of businesses and workers, right? Because they're tied. One of the biggest problems that my entrepreneur friends describe to me is that their prospective customers don't have enough money to buy their goods. And so remember, when you pay workers more, you create consumers that have more money to spend. And when you accommodate for the effect of a higher minimum wage, you can't discount the effect of more spending power of your workers to buy your own goods and the goods of your fellow entrepreneurs. So, you know, my view of it, and we can agree to disagree, but my view of it is you actually end up creating a better business climate with workers who have more disposable income to buy your goods. That the biggest problem we have is that the people who need to buy things that businesses are making have no money to buy those things. And so my simple solution is let's make work pay better so that the people who need to buy things have more money to spend.
And I love that idealism. I really do. I just think that there are certain sectors and certain businesses that could not survive, and I feel that it would be wrong for government to say that if you can't come up with a good product that's good enough to charge $25 an hour for, then you shouldn't be in business. And that's where I worry that we take things too far. Yes, I want higher wages. Yes, I want people to have retirement security. Yes, I want people to be healthy in the middle class. And I think everyone here does. But I think we have to be strategic. And I mean, we haven't talked about, you know, any in depth, but, you know, there are ways to tier this thing. So certain industries have exemptions, certain don't. But I think it's very heavy-handed of a government to come in and say, if you can't afford to pay $25 an hour to workers, then your product isn't good enough and you should go out of business. I think that's dangerous, and I think if we did that in California, that you would have an unemployment crisis almost instantly. And it's funny because when you compare the approaches of the state, and you've looked at, even during the Great Recession and over the last couple of years, the different communities and counties that take different approaches, you look at the two that are the outliers and have been successful in terms of their unemployment rate: Orange County, which has a more free market approach, and the Silicon Valley, which has benefited from a tech boom. Everyone else in the middle has not been that successful, and that's because I think these heavy-handed policies don't necessarily return the idealism we would like them to.
Gents, no, you can't. No, no, no. This is where the roller derby side of me comes out. We have come to the end because all of this is for naught if we can't actually vote, which is what we're going to do momentarily. But before we do that, each one of you gets exactly 1 minute. Do with that minute what you will, make whatever case you want, but it is 1 minute, and I'm going to wait for our timekeeper. He's got his eye on the clock. Here we go. We're going to start with Joe. You can do with it whatever you want, but the question and the answer will have to be 1 minute. You may have more faith than I do. I hear that. We start with Joe. It is his minute to begin. On your mark, get set, go.
The problem with California's economy isn't that there aren't enough jobs. The problem is the jobs that there are don't pay well enough so that people can afford their basic needs. You cited the unemployment statistics in some counties, but low unemployment in some of California's counties only describes part of the picture. It doesn't describe all the people who are working, who are making wages that are too low to even provide 3 meals a day for their kids. You know, leadership and policy requires risk. And I'm more concerned about the 3 of 4 Californians who are working and literally can't handle a broken wrist without financial crisis than the business that might have a little bit of a harder time. There's no perfect outcome and there's no perfect policy vision. You have to ask yourself where you're going to err. And I think we need to err on the side of making things work for the 3 out of 4 Californians who themselves are working but don't live with financial security.
There you go. And now, Brian, to you for exactly 1 minute. You may do with it what you will.
What's your question?
In 3, 2, 1,
go.
So we're from Canada, and in Canada we're actually implementing free education for post-secondary.
Okay.
And in Ontario, sorry. And it's causing us an issue because as a graduate for myself, I have a hard time in the community finding a job, and it ends up giving the opportunity to the community
question. You're taking his time. Canadian.
So how does the government
subsidized education.
How would they deal with it if no one can get a job and then the companies are paying us less because there's so many of us?
That's why you don't make education free. There's the answer to your question. And then we could talk more after. Thank you all very much for coming. Here's the reality. Like, the shrinking middle class is a really important problem. The Republicans, sadly, in Congress don't know what they're doing on this or much these days, but I don't think the Democrats have the right solutions either. I think that forums like this make it easier to get where we want to go, but I firmly believe that any time that we put our faith in this entity so far away, whether it be Sacramento or Washington, D.C., to solve our problems at home, we're doing a disservice to ourselves, because we as a community can solve these problems, but we have to come together and do it. And that's how most things in this country and the great things in this world have been built. They haven't been built by mandate. They haven't been built by some regulation. They've been built by people coming together and demanding it and doing it themselves. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both to everyone here now this evening, to our two fierce contenders who did keep it civil. I hand it back now to Cohen.
Wow, folks. How awesome was that? Wow, civil discourse. Thank you so much, Joe, Brian, Alex. That was tremendous. That's exactly what we need to see more of in our country today. Disagreeing without being disagreeable, civil discourse. Folks, that concludes tonight's event. We're going to be back here next Monday. And Alex, you said, how about education? That's our topic for next week. It actually is our topic next week. And then the following week will be about housing in LA. So we do hope to see you back here next week. If you can't be here physically, check us out on the Facebook Live feed. And if you missed that, no problem. There's also a video that you can catch on the procon.org website. Before you go, make sure you get a chance to vote and let us know whether you are now pro or now con with your score for the intensity of it. But otherwise, folks who are watching on your mobile devices or from your living rooms, and those of you who are here shivering after a beautiful sunset, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.